Hola clase, hola. So language. Well, where do I even start with the language? There's so many places to start. Let's say that let's hope that you get an understanding of how complex the complexity of language acquisition and all the intricacies about language and the role of language in the classroom. So things that you need to know about. These are going to be sound bites. I'm going to explain some things to you, but I mean, we could talk about language for years. Some things that you need to understand. Language domains. It is better to understand the complexity of language instead of just looking at it as a holistic thing, like a whole language kind of approach, like is the student proficient in English or not? Well, it's a little more complex than that. You know, it would be better if we analyze language from the perspective of the domains, productive domains and receptive domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Why? Because it will allow you to see that many people arrive to language and second language acquisition from different pathways. Some people develop different oracy. Some people have different literacy, depending on literacy at home, exposure to education in L1. Different ways of looking at language if we analyze each domain differently and understand that language is not just this one thing that we can take and summarize whether you are at a level or not. It's more detailed than that, and it's got smaller sections that you may want to analyze differently, individually. Also, social language versus cognitive academic language, and the cognitive demand on one or the other, and the research that has been done for decades on one or the other, and all the fight that, you know, the threshold hypothesis, and academic language is more cognitively demanding than social language. So kids that don't have 5 to 6 years of schooling in their L1, they come to our American schools with semilingualism. They don't speak in their no-nos, no Spanish, no English, they don't speak anything. I don't agree with that. I believe oracy and social language and the language of the house is a fund of knowledge, is a valid form of communication. I don't believe there is enough research to claim that it's less cognitive demanding than academic language. You can see how these things, academic, social, semi-lingualism, it gives you a perception that some language is better or more important than other. It privileges particular types of dialect, particular types of communication patterns, language, academic versus social, the language of the school, the language of the privileged, the language of the upper class, versus the social language of the house, the social language of minority students, different socioeconomic status associated to that. There's not enough research for that. Maybe common sense tells you, it's like, of course, talking about Shakespeare and talking about literature is more cognitively demanding than speaking African-American vernacular English. I would like to see some Shakespearean scholars trying to understand and make sense of Ebonics in inner city Bronx or Brooklyn, and see if they think that's not cognitively demanding. The social language of the African-American inner city experience or the Mexican-American experience. I don't think there's enough research to that. Maybe we just seem to come from a perspective that we privilege this academic language as the elevated one and everything else is not so good. Let's be careful with that. Let's analyze it, let's critically analyze it, and you can come to your own conclusions. There is research on this. There's also research on the critical period hypothesis that claims that, children can learn faster and better than adults. Not true. I can tell you from experience that's not true. I have had students in their 80s, retired, that with zero Spanish. They knew German. This particular student I'm thinking about knew German and English and wanted to learn Spanish. And he was retired. Well, in like 2 or 3 years after he retired, he took on classical guitar and he was doing small concerts in coffee shops in town after 3 years, and he was speaking Spanish. He actually went to Mexico for a summer to put it into practice in 2 or 3 years, and I was his private tutor. I was teaching him Spanish in his 80s. What's the problem? Oh, what was the issue? Well, maybe he was a very smart man, true, but at the same time, he didn't have anything else to do. He was retired. He didn't have work. He didn't have a wife. He didn't have children. He had all day to play. He used to wake up like 6 in the morning, meditate. He was a Buddhist too. He used to meditate and then play guitar for hours. How many of us in our mid-age can do that? Children, I don't know, think about it. Think about what kinds of, they don't have they don't have bills to pay. They don't have love relationships to deal with. Children, wives, ex-wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, you know, their lives is just absorbing the world around them. So I don't, you know, what we do know about critical period hypothesis is the development of accent, native-like accent. We do know that there is a threshold that after X number of years it's more difficult for a second language learner to speak like a native than a child. A child develops native-like accent easier than past 12 years of age. There's a threshold where we start seeing more difficulties, in part because you already have your organs shaped up, your vocal cords, the way you transfer your air through your nose, you're more nasal, or your lung speaking, or your mouth is shaped in a particular way, your lips, the way you produce your consonants, it becomes more solidified, and so it's more difficult to change with age. Children have an easier time with that, but nothing about acquisition of language. Okay, what else? These are just little things that you need to understand about language. Language in the classroom, relationship between language and content. And this is when we get to shelter instruction, SIOP, shelter instruction observation protocol. Content objectives, language objectives. There is such a thing as the language of math. Math is not the universal language, I promise. There is a language of science. There is a language of language. The language of social studies. These need to be addressed in class. We use language as the tool, as the vehicle for getting to content, and we ignore it. We assume that everybody understands what we're saying, and that language in itself, the tool itself, needs to be explained. It needs to be approached in the classroom implicitly. This is one of the main principles of shelter instruction. At any rate, language objectives, language and content, the relationship between one and the other. And as teaching language, I like to put together these three concepts that I think align really well. Krashen's input hypothesis, I+1, with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, ZPD, and scaffolding, as I understand it. So Krashen's I+1 tells us, and this is something that can be approached or applied to many other disciplines, but in language, we want to take the student to the next logical level. So we're going to give I as the information that the student already has or comes with. And then we want to give them a +1, the next logical level in language, you know, we're teaching them something. So we go from simple sentence to more complex sentence, from tangible object, observable nouns to qualifiers of that noun. Give them that next logical step in their learning progression. This is I+1. You don't want to do I+7, I+3. You don't want too big of a gap. You lose them. It's not logical. This is similar to Vygotsky's zones of proximal development. The student is right here. What is their next proximal development zone? What is that next logical step for their development? And that's how I see scaffolding. Scaffolding is guiding students up, or however you see scaffolding, usually in the Western world is up, by putting the support they need, then allowing them to go to the next level. In scaffolding, we tend to remove the scaffold. Other people say no, the scaffold stays and the student just progresses. But some people remove the support and they just move up higher levels. Logical steps, logical size steps, +1, not +3 or +4. So this is how I put together Krashen's input hypothesis, zone of proximal development, and scaffolding. All right, and that's all I have for now. I could talk about language for days. So these are some of the principles you need to deal with. I look forward to seeing you in the discussions. Adios.